Los Angeles, January 15th, 1947. The air was warm, smelling of eucalyptus and the distant sea. But this was the day the City of Stars lost its glamour, replaced by a grotesque, haunting shadow. This story is not about Hollywood dreams. It's about a nightmare that became a defining moment of American true crime. A case so gruesome, so perplexing, and so steeped in the dark heart of post-war LA that it remains a festering wound on the history of justice. This is the unsolved murder of Elizabeth Short, the young woman the press would immortalize as the Black Dahlia. Her name was Elizabeth. She was 22, striking, with jet black hair and ambition that far outpaced her talent. Like thousands of others, she came to Hollywood seeking fame, but found only low-rent apartments, transient jobs, and the company of soldiers and sailors. She was a woman of her time, charming but perhaps too trusting, floating on the edges of the film industry, always hoping for that one big break. Her last known days were spent in San Diego and then at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown LA, waiting for a date she believed would change her fortunes. She was last seen alive, stepping into the lobby of the Biltmore on January 9th, 1947. Then the silence. The discovery was made 6 days later, a little after 10 a.m., by a woman named Betty Bersinger, walking with her 3-year-old daughter along a vacant lot on the west side of South Norton Avenue in the Leimert Park area. At first, Bersinger thought she saw a mannequin, but as she drew closer, the horrifying truth revealed itself. The body was lying face up, perfectly centered on the grass, severed completely in half at the waist. The division was surgically precise, indicating the work of someone with anatomical knowledge. The skin was drained of blood, whitened by a thorough cleansing, and the face had been mutilated with what police would later call a Glasgow smile, a horrific Joker-like cut extending from the corners of her mouth across her cheeks. The body had been posed, a grotesque performance art left for the city to find. The LAPD, known as the LAPD, and the Sheriff's Department quickly converged on the scene. The precision of the bisection, the absence of blood at the scene, and the careful staging of the remains immediately signaled that this was not a random, panicked act of violence. This was meticulous, cold-blooded torture and murder committed elsewhere, with the body transported and displayed. The internal organs had been removed and cleansed, and the entire body had been carefully wiped clean before being left in the lot. This level of planning was almost unheard of in 1947. The victim was quickly identified by her fingerprints as Elizabeth Short. The subsequent press coverage was a frenzy, unprecedented even for Hollywood. The papers, especially the Hearst-owned Los Angeles Examiner, sensationalized every gruesome detail. They coined the nickname the Black Dahlia, a nod to the 1946 film The Blue Dahlia and Elizabeth's fondness for wearing black clothing. This nickname, while fueling public terror, ultimately obscured the victim herself, transforming a hopeful young woman into a lurid legend. The investigation descended almost immediately into chaos. The sheer brutality of the crime spurred immediate public hysteria, leading to an onslaught of false confessions. Over the next few weeks, more than 50 men and some women would confess to the murder. The LAPD, overwhelmed and facing immense political pressure, struggled to separate fact from fantasy. The case became a jurisdictional tug-of-war between the LAPD and the Sheriff's Department, leading to internal feuds, poor communication, and key evidence being mishandled or overlooked. The killer, however, was not silent. About a week after the body was found, the Los Angeles Examiner received a curious package. It contained Elizabeth Short's Social Security card, her birth certificate, several business cards, and an address book, all wrapped in a note that was cut and pasted from newspaper clippings, commonly known as a ransom note style. Crucially, the items had been washed clean with gasoline to remove fingerprints. The killer was actively taunting the police, demonstrating a cold, calculating intelligence. The address book became a centerpiece of the investigation. It contained numerous names, mostly military men Elizabeth had met during her travels. Each name had to be tracked down, interrogated, and cleared. This painstaking process absorbed months of police resources and led investigators deep into the transient, post-war underworld of Southern California, from military bases to low-end nightclubs and hotels. The investigation hit a crucial roadblock almost immediately because no primary crime scene was ever located. Without a specific location, police couldn't find physical evidence like blood spatter, trace fibers, or tool marks. They only had the body itself, and the body told a story of professional cruelty. The precise bisection suggested a level of skill, possibly from a butcher, a medical student, or a surgeon. The coroner's report confirmed that the cut that divided her body was made by a sharp, thin blade, like a scalpel or a very fine fillet knife. One of the first major suspects to emerge was a doctor named Walter Bailey, a man with known sadistic tendencies and a history of drunken violence. He worked in a hospital in Pasadena. Police interviewed him, but no conclusive evidence linked him to Elizabeth. Another key person of interest was a man named Robert Manley, a doctor known to be in love with Elizabeth and who had a history of obsession with young women. Manley eventually committed suicide, leaving a note that many believed was a confession, but his timeline for the period of the murder did not conclusively place him with Elizabeth. The list of formal suspects was long, including prominent figures in Los Angeles society. Dr. George Hodel, a respected physician and socialite, emerged as a compelling suspect years later through the investigation of his own son, Steve Hodel, a retired LAPD detective. Steve Hodel claimed his father, who died in 1999, was the killer, citing his father's medical background, proximity to the vacant lot, and alleged evidence found in his father's former home, including photographs that looked eerily like Elizabeth. The LAPD's original file on George Hodel showed he was a primary suspect in 1950, and police had even bugged his home. Tapes from the bugging allegedly recorded George Hodel saying, "Supposin' I did kill the Black Dahlia. They couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead." Despite this compelling circumstantial evidence, George Hodel was never charged, and the official investigation eventually went cold. The Black Dahlia case had a chilling ripple effect, not only terrifying the public, but also highlighting a pattern of violence against young women in the area. In the years that followed, several other mutilated bodies were found, including the murder of Jean French and Laura Trelstad, both exhibiting elements of the Black Dahlia's precise cutting and mutilation. While police tried to link these copycat killings, a lack of firm evidence prevented the cases from being officially connected, leading to some to believe a serial killer was operating in post-war LA, utilizing the Black Dahlia's terrifying method. The case remains technically open with the LAPD, a constant reminder of the failure to bring justice for Elizabeth Short. The legacy of the Black Dahlia is not just one of a sensational murder, but a stark portrait of a city unraveling. It exposed the dark underbelly of Hollywood glamour, where dreams quickly turn into desperation, and where a killer could operate with impunity, leaving behind only an unsolvable puzzle wrapped in a beautiful, horrifying mystery. The truth is buried somewhere in the records of 1,000 interviews, 100 dead ends, and the silent, sun-drenched lot in Limert Park, forever waiting for its voice to be heard.
The original investigation's inability to definitively pin down the killer allowed the myth of the Black Dahlia to consume the facts of Elizabeth Short's life and death. But let us return to the specifics of the evidence, the elements that truly set this case apart, pushing it beyond the realm of common murder into the realm of high-profile medical sadism. The body's condition was paramount. Beyond the bisection and the facial mutilation, the extensive tissue manipulation was the signature of the killer. Small incisions were found on her breasts, and patterns of ligature marks suggested she had been bound for a significant period before her death. The official autopsy revealed no signs of seminal fluid, indicating that the torture was non-sexual in nature, or perhaps the killer was meticulous enough to clean even this evidence away. However, the presence of specific, precise injuries, like the deliberate removal of several teeth post-mortem and the bruises found on her head, confirmed a prolonged period of torment before the fatal blow. The method of death itself was initially obscured by the disfigurement. The true cause of death was determined to be shock and hemorrhage from the massive trauma to the head and face, specifically the large lacerations. However, the bisection was performed after death. This detail is crucial. It means the killer spent hours with the body, first torturing her, then killing her, and then meticulously cleaning, draining, and dismembering her. This points to a killer who had a safe, isolated location, a private residence, a rented surgical room, or an isolated workshop, and ample time to carry out their methodical depravity without interruption. The killer was not panicked. They were performing a calculated, ritualistic act. One of the most promising yet frustrating leads involved a pair of cement bags found near the crime scene, believed to have been used to carry the body halves. These bags were traced to a specific manufacturer and distributor, but the trail went cold before it could identify a purchaser. Similarly, police explored a report that Elizabeth Short had spent time in a military hospital in San Diego prior to her disappearance, being treated for a venereal disease. This detail, though unconfirmed, was leaked to the press, further smearing Elizabeth's reputation and focusing police attention on military personnel, potentially drawing them away from civilian or professional suspects. The military focus led to the extensive vetting of hundreds of sailors and soldiers, including figures like Major General Stephen P. Gano, but without any conclusive link. The true breakthrough that never materialized was the identification of the murder weapon, or rather, the murder tools. The bisection was accomplished using techniques that would not typically be used by an amateur. The cut followed the lines of the lumbar spine, indicating anatomical knowledge to avoid major bone structures and simplify the separation. The facial cuts were equally skilled. Detectives consulted with medical experts and veterinarians to understand the tools necessary for such clean cuts, confirming the high probability that the killer was skilled in surgery or butchery. The case also introduced one of the first known instances of a killer engaging in media correspondence in the U.S. In addition to the package with the documents, the killer sent several communications, including handwritten notes promising to surrender or promising to mail Elizabeth's clothing to the police chief. In one particularly macabre instance, a handbag and one shoe belonging to Elizabeth were found deposited in a garbage can, exactly as the taunting letter promised. These communications were a mix of typed and handwritten notes, but frustratingly, no legible fingerprints were ever lifted from them. The killer was an intellectual game player, using the media's insatiable appetite for sensationalism to both boast of their crime and deliberately mislead the authorities. The failure to find the killer led to immense public backlash and institutional change within the LAPD. The widespread criticism over the lack of interagency cooperation and the chaotic nature of the investigation led to significant restructuring and the development of more standardized major crime procedures in the city. The Black Dahlia case effectively taught the LAPD how not to investigate a complex serial or high-profile murder, leading directly to future procedural improvements, but tragically not to justice for Elizabeth Short. The modern cold case analysis often circles back to the suspects identified in the immediate aftermath, including the aforementioned Dr. George Hodel. Steve Hodell's investigation, while controversial and non-official, provided a geographical link. The Hodel residence was located very close to the vacant lot where Elizabeth Short was found. Furthermore, the property had an extensive yard and outbuildings that could have easily served as the isolated location for the dismemberment. Steve Hodel also claimed his father was linked to other murders in the area, suggesting a broader pattern of sadism. This theory remains one of the most compelling narratives surrounding the case, largely because of the suspect's specific surgical background and his known dark psychological profile. However, the case is a mosaic of possibilities, and other theories persist. One theory points to a possible connection with the mob, suggesting Elizabeth, who frequently dated men of various, often questionable backgrounds, may have stumbled into an organized crime situation, and her death was a message. Another theory, less common, suggests the killer was a frustrated aspiring surgeon or medical student, venting deep-seated frustration and psychological trauma through this horrific act of mastery over the human body. The enduring fascination with the Black Dahlia is rooted in its unsolvability and the potent symbolism of its setting. L.A. in 1947 was the perfect crucible, a city built on illusion, struggling with the chaotic transition from World War II military life back to civilian reality. Elizabeth Short embodied the fragile dream of the young starlet, and her murder brutally exposed the rotten core beneath Hollywood's glittering facade. It was a crime that marked the end of an era of innocence, ushering in the dark noir reality that would define the city's reputation for decades to come. Elizabeth Short may have sought fame, but her legacy rests in a darkness she never sought, the victim of a calculated monster who weaponized the city's media and left behind the most notorious cold case in American history.
The sheer depth of the official investigation into the Black Dahlia case is a testament to the chaos and desperation that seized the city. At its peak, the LAPD assigned over 300 detectives to the case, a number unheard of at the time. Yet this high volume of personnel contributed to the confusion. Tips poured in by the hundreds daily, phone lines were constantly jammed, and the sheer volume of material overwhelmed the records department. In the urgency to solve the case, many lines of inquiry were pursued too hastily, and others, potentially crucial, were dropped too quickly. One significant element that remains ambiguous is the 6 days Elizabeth Short was missing between January 9th, when she was last seen leaving the Biltmore Hotel, and January 15th, when her body was found. Where was she held? Who was she with? Did she go willingly? The initial police theory suggested she was with the killer for those 6 days, implying a period of captivity and mounting terror. This time frame is critical as it defines the window the killer had to perform the acts of sadism and dismemberment. The location of her disappearance, the Biltmore Hotel, a glamorous hub in downtown LA, suggests she was meeting someone who had access to high-end locations. However, the eventual dumping ground in Leimert Park was a deserted middle-class area, a stark contrast. Investigators theorized that the killer intentionally chose a location that had no immediate connection to Elizabeth's life or background, further obscuring their identity. The detailed forensic analysis performed in 1947, though limited by the technology of the era, yielded small, tantalizing clues that a modern investigation would seize upon. Minute traces of animal hair were found on Elizabeth's coat, leading to theories that the killer might have worked on a farm, or perhaps at a veterinary office or a tannery, linking back to the professional skill needed for the bisection. Furthermore, the extensive cleansing of the body suggested the use of specialized detergents or disinfectants, chemicals that were more readily available in medical or industrial settings, again pointing towards a professional occupation. The pressure on the LAPD eventually led to a desperate and ultimately damaging move. Seeking to control the narrative and perhaps draw out the killer, the police released a highly detailed, graphic account of the crime scene and autopsy to the media. While this did lead to another wave of false confessions, it fundamentally violated the trust of the public and the victim's family, and it turned the investigation into a permanent media spectacle, arguably making it harder for the police to function rationally.
The Los Angeles Herald-Express went so far as to offer a substantial reward for information, creating an environment where monetary incentive outweighed truthful testimony. In the years following, the murder's shadow stretched far beyond California. It inspired countless books, films, and documentaries, each adding layers of speculation and fiction. Yet the core truth remains elusive. The Black Dahlia case represents a moment where the modern American fascination with serial violence began to take shape. It was the moment the serial killer stepped out of the shadows and began communicating directly with the public via the media, a phenomenon that would repeat tragically throughout the 20th century. The enduring mystery is not just who killed Elizabeth Short, but why they chose such an elaborate, signature method. The murder was about control, power, and the ultimate dehumanization of the victim. The killer didn't just take a life, they created an object, a symbol of horror, and presented it to the world. That meticulous, sadistic performance is the true legacy of the Black Dahlia, a gruesome, unsolved puzzle that forever stains the golden age of Hollywood. The story of Elizabeth Short is a chilling reminder that sometimes the darkness beneath the surface is more terrifying than any fictional monster we could imagine. The truth lies buried in the forgotten corners of 1947 Los Angeles, still whispering the secrets of the Black Dahlia.
The relentless scrutiny and the failure to secure a conviction eventually transformed the official LAPD files into a graveyard of promising leads. To understand the depth of the investigation's failure, we must examine the key suspects who were identified but ultimately slipped away due to lack of definitive evidence, jurisdictional limitations, or the killer's masterful cleaning of the crime scene. Foremost among the early suspects was Leslie Dillon, a bellhop and a former assistant to a physician. Dillon had checked into a motel room shortly after the murder and began making bizarre, highly detailed statements about the crime to the police. He claimed to have seen Elizabeth Short alive in the company of a man named Jeff Connors, and his intimate knowledge of the scene led investigators to believe he was either the killer or directly involved. Dillon's story, however, twisted and changed under interrogation, eventually revealing itself to be a complex, unreliable narrative, possibly driven by a desire for attention or psychological instability. Despite the intense focus on him, Dillon was eventually released, having wasted significant police resources without providing a breakthrough. Another significant area of focus centered on a wealthy, established figure named Norman Chandler, the son of the publisher of the Los Angeles Times. While seemingly protected by his family's influence, Chandler was investigated due to his known proximity to the seedier elements of Hollywood society and rumors of his involvement in occult practices. The theory surrounding him suggested that Elizabeth Short, through her numerous connections to servicemen and aspiring artists, may have encountered Chandler or his associates in an environment far removed from the public eye. However, the evidence against him was purely circumstantial, and the investigation into powerful figures in LA society often met with bureaucratic resistance and dead ends, a recurring motif in this dark chapter of the city's history. The sheer volume of false confessions also became a form of protection for the actual killer. Every man who claimed to be the Black Dahlia murderer forced the police to dedicate precious time and resources to verification. These confessions came from disgruntled veterans, attention seekers, and disturbed individuals, all eager to insert themselves into the decade's most sensational headline. In one bizarre instance, a man named Joseph A. Dumais confessed in vivid detail, claiming he had performed the dismemberment, but upon cross-examination his story fell apart, proving he had simply been regurgitating details released by the newspapers. This media saturation, while satisfying the public appetite, poisoned the well of reliable information. The anatomical precision of the bisection continued to be the most compelling piece of evidence pointing toward a medically trained individual. This professional signature gave rise to the enduring focus on doctors and surgeons.
The case file contains extensive, detailed interviews with dozens of physicians in the Los Angeles and San Diego areas who could not definitively account for their time during the crucial 6-day period. This is where the theory involving Dr. George Hodel finds its roots. Beyond the circumstantial evidence of his home's proximity to the crime scene and his surgical skills, Hodel's personal history hinted at a dark, controlling nature. He had previously been accused of sexual abuse, and the subsequent trial, though ending in his acquittal, revealed a disturbing psychological profile and connections to powerful socialites and artists who engaged in illicit activities. The wiretap transcripts from the 1950 surveillance of Hodel's home, where he allegedly spoke of the Dahlia murder, are the closest the police ever came to a direct confession, yet they were not deemed admissible or conclusive enough to withstand a prosecution at the time, leading to the abrupt closure of that line of inquiry. The ultimate failure of the Black Dahlia investigation can be attributed not to a single error, but to a confluence of factors: the killer's meticulous planning, the contamination of the crime scene by spectators and police alike, the lack of centralized forensic technology, and the overwhelming destructive influence of the media. The city wanted a quick resolution, and the LAPD, under immense pressure, chased quantity of suspects over quality of evidence. Decades later, the case remains a morbid touchstone, a perfect storm of Hollywood ambition and American pathology. The image of Elizabeth Short severed and posed is less a photograph of a crime scene and more a metaphor for the broken promises of the American dream in the post-war era. Her murder was the moment the public realized that even in the most glittering corners of the country, true, horrifying evil could operate with surgical precision and remain completely untraced. The Black Dahlia is not merely a cold case, it is the ultimate American Gothic horror story, a masterpiece of criminal staging that has captivated and confounded the world for over 75 years.
The enduring presence of the Black Dahlia mystery in the American consciousness is largely due to the psychological terror the killer successfully manufactured. This was a crime deliberately orchestrated to shock, not just to kill. The mutilations and the theatrical staging speak to a killer who was not just violent, but highly narcissistic, craving recognition for their horrific work while maintaining absolute anonymity. The facial mutilation, the so-called Glasgow smile, is one of the most chilling elements. This act was clearly intended to dehumanize Elizabeth Short, transforming her beautiful, expressive face into a mask of perpetual agony. It forced the city and the nation to confront an image of pure sadism, elevating the crime beyond a simple murder of passion or robbery. It was a calculated act of symbolic destruction. Furthermore, the practice of excising internal organs and draining the body of blood speaks volumes about the killer's pathology. This meticulous cleanup suggests an attempt to erase the body's natural state, perhaps to symbolically cleanse the victim, or to eliminate trace evidence, such as blood type analysis or specific DNA, which, while unknown to forensics in 1947, a forensically aware killer might have preemptively considered. The entire process, the cleansing, the bisection, the posing, suggests a killer who viewed the body not as a human being, but as material to be manipulated, consistent with the mindset of a high-functioning psychopath who feels entitled to perform such acts. The geographical distance between Elizabeth's last sighting at the Biltmore and the dumping ground in Leimert Park, roughly 5 miles, is often analyzed. The location was residential but deserted, an area of undeveloped lots, making it easy to access and leave quickly without drawing attention. The body was placed near the sidewalk, ensuring discovery. This again points to a killer prioritizing the public display of the body over concealing the crime. They wanted the body found, and found quickly, to maximize the terror and media exposure.
The police files of the time include intriguing but inconclusive reports of witnesses who claim to have seen a dark sedan parked near the vacant lot late the night before the body was found. Descriptions varied, but the consistent element was a man moving quickly, possibly handling heavy bags. While these tips did not lead to an identification, they support the theory of a planned late-night dumping, executed under cover of darkness to avoid direct confrontation, yet placed strategically for the morning discovery. The Black Dahlia case also highlights the early, clumsy attempts at offender profiling. Psychological consultants were brought in, offering varied and conflicting assessments. Some believed the killer was an older, established man, the A-type figure, with a respected profession, masking deep psychological disturbance. Others speculated it was a younger man, perhaps a frustrated medical student or a veteran, traumatized by war, attempting to reenact or assert control through violence. These profiles, while rudimentary, reinforced the surgical suspect theory, keeping the police focused on the medical community. The continued correspondence from the supposed killer or copycats long after the murder date further complicated the case. The police received numerous letters, some promising the next victim, others simply mocking the LAPD's incompetence. While most of these were quickly identified as hoaxes, the difficulty lay in discerning the authentic taunts from the fake ones. The package containing Elizabeth's personal documents was almost certainly authentic, but the numerous subsequent letters served only to muddy the waters and increase public anxiety, essentially allowing the killer to continue his psychological reign long after the physical murder was complete. Ultimately, the murder of Elizabeth Short became an artifact of its time, inextricably linked to the post-war culture of transient living, loosened morals, and the dark promise of Hollywood. It remains the case that redefined the relationship between the criminal act and the American media, a gruesome performance piece that achieved its killer's likely aim, eternal, terrifying infamy. The identity of the Black Dahlia's killer is perhaps the most heavily guarded secret in American criminal history. A secret the vast, silent city of Los Angeles continues to hold close.
The legacy of the Black Dahlia case is not merely in its unsolvability, but in the long shadow it cast over subsequent high-profile crimes in California. It created a template for media sensationalism and established a precedent for the public fascination with the meticulously executed, ritualistic murder. Following the initial frenzy, the LAPD found itself facing what many feared was a connection to a pattern of dismemberment and murder, suggesting the existence of a larger network of crime, or, more chillingly, a serial killer honing his craft. Detectives struggled to ascertain if Elizabeth Short's murder was an isolated, if extraordinarily brutal, incident or the opening move in a campaign of terror. The subsequent discovery of other mutilated bodies, notably that of Jean French just a few months later, reinforced the latter fear. French's body, found near the ocean, also bore evidence of post-mortem mutilation, and a cryptic note scrawled on her body initially suggested a copycat. The key challenge for investigators was distinguishing between the original killer's precise signature and the imitators drawn by the Dahlia's notoriety. The search for the primary crime scene led investigators down countless frustrating paths. They meticulously combed every known location Elizabeth Short had visited, from flop houses in downtown LA to the luxurious homes of her fleeting wealthy acquaintances. The absolute lack of blood at the dumping site meant the location of the murder was likely a soundproofed, private, and thoroughly sanitized space. Theories ranged from a rented cabin in the desolate hills of Malibu, a remote warehouse, or a specific room within a large, rambling estate, the type of property easily accessible to a high-status suspect like George Hodel, but impossible to search thoroughly without a warrant for every square inch.
The most crucial and perhaps most disappointing aspect of the evidence trail involves the potential for DNA evidence. While DNA technology did not exist in 1947, the LAPD preserved certain key pieces of evidence: the letters sent by the killer, the address book, and some of Elizabeth Short's remaining clothing. In modern times, law enforcement has made attempts to retrieve touch DNA from these preserved artifacts. However, the killer's meticulous cleaning, the use of gasoline on the package contents, the general cleansing of the body and clothing may have completely degraded or eliminated any viable biological material. This foresight, if intentional, highlights a level of criminal sophistication that was generations ahead of the forensic science of the time. The myth surrounding Elizabeth Short herself also became a critical barrier to solving the case. The press portrayed her in wildly contradictory terms, as a tragic, innocent girl who stumbled into evil, and conversely, as a reckless partygoer whose lifestyle led her to danger. The reality was likely somewhere in between. She was a young woman chasing a dream, moving quickly through a transitional, sometimes dangerous society. This focus on her character, rather than the facts of her disappearance, diverted attention and empathy away from the victim, a common psychological barrier in many high-profile female homicides. The ultimate tragedy of the Black Dahlia is that the killer achieved a kind of immortality through their calculated anonymity and artistic horror. They not only destroyed Elizabeth Short's life, but also hijacked her identity, ensuring that the name Black Dahlia would forever conjure the image of a gruesome spectacle, rather than the hopeful, if misguided, young woman from Massachusetts who came west seeking a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. The case remains a testament to the chilling power of a killer who understood the American media's need for spectacle, ensuring that even in the absence of justice, the story would never fade.
The relentless passage of time has failed to dull the sharp edges of the Black Dahlia mystery. Instead, it has cemented Elizabeth Short's murder as a foundational text of American noir, a story of the beautiful promise of California turning irrevocably dark. We are left with the definitive conclusion that no single piece of circumstantial evidence was strong enough or clean enough to stand up to the meticulous, anonymous evil that orchestrated this crime. The investigation's legacy is defined by a series of near misses and tantalizing fragments. There was the surgical proficiency of the bisection, suggesting a doctor or anatomist. There was the psychological profile revealed in the taunting letters, indicating high intelligence and severe narcissism. There were the geographical overlaps, particularly the enduring, unsettling connection to figures like Dr. George Hodel. Yet each thread ultimately frayed under the intense scrutiny of the era, leaving investigators with only the performance of the crime itself. The Black Dahlia case fundamentally changed how law enforcement views the intersection of crime and media. It taught detectives that the killer's intent may not be concealment, but communication. Elizabeth Short was silenced, but her body was made to speak volumes to the public and the police, dominating headlines and driving cultural fear for years. This was an act of terror by correspondence, a crime engineered for maximum, lasting impact. Today, Elizabeth Short rests in an unmarked grave, her murder file growing thicker with the passing years, holding hundreds of thousands of documents that have never yielded a conclusive answer. The pursuit of justice continues, driven by retired detectives and dedicated true crime enthusiasts who sift through the aging files, hoping to find the single piece of evidence that the technology of 1947 failed to reveal. The hope remains that advances in familial DNA tracing or enhanced forensic preservation techniques might one day pierce the veil of time and finally name the man who extinguished the life of Elizabeth Short,
and left her body as a permanent, chilling monument to the dark side of the American dream. Until that day comes, the Black Dahlia remains the quintessential unsolved Hollywood tragedy. A beautiful young woman swallowed by the sprawling, brutal silence of a city that promised her everything, but delivered only infamy. The shadow she cast on January 15, 1947, still lingers over Los Angeles, a cold, unsolved reminder that some nightmares are real and some scars never fade.